The torches sputter, their smoky glow clinging to the carved beams overhead, and the air feels heavy, like it has been trapped in this chamber for centuries. You can almost smell it. The sour tang of sweat soaked into velvet, the staleness of meat gone wrong, and beneath it all, the faint metallic whiff of infection. This is not the grand court of Henry VIII you imagine from paintings. This is the prison of a king rotting in real time. And yes, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in here, unless you've developed a taste for foul air and fainting fits. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in the royal apartments of Whitehall Palace, January 1547. Henry VIII, once the towering Renaissance prince who could outdance, outhunt and outride any man in Europe, now lies trapped inside a body betraying him at every turn. The room is hushed, though the silence isn't peaceful, it's fearful. Every servant stepping near the bed does so like a mouse skittering past a sleeping lion. Everyone knows what's coming, but no one dares speak it aloud. The king's breath rattles like a broken bellows. His enormous frame, nearly 400 pounds at the end, sinks into a mound of feather-stuffed mattresses. The velvet canopy above him seems more tomb than shelter. You notice how his face, once flushed with hunting fires and courtly dances, now hangs slack, splotched, and almost waxen. The courtiers whisper outside the door, exchanging glances that say more than words. Their monarch, the man who executed wives, toppled monasteries, and defied the Pope, is slipping away, and no priest has yet been called to ease him into the next world. The irony is sharp. This is a king obsessed with control, who once declared himself the supreme head of the English Church, now losing control over the simplest function of all, his own body. His legs are wrapped in cloths to hide ulcers that seep and stink. His torso heaves like it is carrying twice the weight it should. His eyes dart, fevered, as if even in dying he still suspects plots. Historians still argue whether this moment was marked more by fear of God or fear of Henry. After all, summoning a priest too soon could be taken as treason, as if admitting the king was near death meant hoping for it. But waiting too long, that was spiritual negligence, leaving the king's soul to teeter unprepared on the edge of eternity. This terrible dance of hesitation filled the air, just as surely as the stench of decay. Yet amid the grim tension, a few odd details emerge. Chroniclers note that Henry spoke of visions in those final days, seeing apparitions at the edge of his chamber, shadows of guilt perhaps, or the fevers of a body drowning in infection. One tale, half believed, half feared, whispered that he muttered the name of Jane Seymour, his true wife, the only one who gave him a son. Did he hope to see her in paradise? Or did he dread facing the other wives whose fates he sealed with a sword? And as you stand there in imagination, you realise the room is more than a deathbed. It is a gallery of ghosts. Every choice Henry made, the dissolved monasteries, the mangled alliances, the headless queens, hovers here, pressing into the heavy air. The bed creaks as he shifts, and the sound carries like a drumbeat. You can't help but feel that the end of his life is also the end of something larger, the roaring, violent drama of Tudor ambition itself, condensed into one man's failing breath. The king groans, servants flinch, no one moves. The silence folds back over the chamber, tighter and colder, and you, standing, listening, already know. This is not a story of royal majesty. This is a story of rot, inside and out. The bedchamber grows colder, though the fire pops and hisses in its grate, throwing out waves of heat that never seem to reach the king. You glance at his legs, swaddled thickly in linen, but the fabric is already stained through. Henry's legs were his greatest torment in these final years, and every chronicler who tiptoed near his bedside wrote of the same horror, ulcers that would not heal. They weren't just cuts or scratches, but cavernous sores burrowing deep into the flesh, dripping foul-smelling pus, and leaving courtiers gagging behind their sleeves. Imagine a wound that keeps reopening every time you try to stand. A wound that festers no matter what ointment or herb you smear on it. This was Henry's constant companion. The king's physicians did what they could. They lanced, they poulticed, they bathed the ulcers in wine and vinegar. Sometimes they bound his legs with rose oil-soaked cloths, hoping a whiff of sweetness might counter the corruption. None of it worked. Some even whispered that his own temper made the wounds worse, that his violent rages caused blood to rise and burst through the broken skin. It is a cruel picture. A monarch feared across Europe, brought low by leaking sores. And it only gets worse when you learn that his courtiers sometimes burned aromatic herbs in the chamber, simply to mask the stench of his decaying flesh. The irony isn't lost on you. This is the same Henry who once jousted in glittering armour, whose calves were praised as the finest in Christendom. Women swooned over those legs in the 1520s, when he danced in silk hose at banquets. Now, those very limbs are crumbling beneath him. Historians still argue whether the root cause was an old jousting accident that shattered his leg in 1536, or whether diabetes and circulatory disease gnawed away at him from within. Either way, every step became agony, and the ulcers turned his body into an open battlefield of infection. And here's the fringe tidbit. The royal physicians didn't just rap and pray. There are records suggesting they experimented with a bizarre contraption, a kind of mechanical boot that could apply pressure and drain the ulcers more effectively. Imagine strapping Henry's enormous legs into what looks like a medieval torture device, all in the name of medicine. It sounds like quackery, but desperate times make desperate doctors. Whether the machine worked or not, the evidence is murky, and it adds to the sense of dread that surrounded his body. You watch him shift under the sheets. Every movement draws a hiss, sometimes a muffled curse. Courtiers who bring food or documents leave as quickly as possible, both out of fear of his temper and of the sickening smell. And yet, you can't help but feel a strange pity. He's trapped in a body that refuses to knit itself back together. In a world without antibiotics, infection was a near-certain death sentence. It spread unseen, poisoning the blood, warping the mind with fevers. Even a common soldier might have died of such wounds. But for a king to suffer them, endlessly, must have felt like divine punishment. And that thought lingered in Tudor minds. Was God punishing Henry for his 6 wives, for his break with Rome, for the executions of loyal friends and rivals alike? The ulcers were more than a medical symptom. They became a symbol, proof to some that God had turned his face away from the once golden prince. The whispers spread through the court, hushed but insistent. No one dared say it aloud, but everyone thought it. The king was rotting alive and no earthly power could stop it. You picture him closing his eyes, sweat glistening on his forehead as the pain dulls to a throb. For a brief second, you can almost believe he is just another man enduring illness. But then the silence breaks with his growl, sharp, angry, commanding, and the illusion vanishes. He is still Henry, still king, still terrifying, even as the sores consume him. And so the room goes quiet again, heavy with dread, waiting for the next groan, the next order, the next reminder that this monarch's body is betraying him piece by piece. The chamber reeks not just of sickness, but of gluttony. Plates are carried in and out, each one stacked with hunks of roasted meat, jellied fish, and loaves of bread thick as bricks. Even as his body crumbles, Henry insists on feasting. You can almost hear the wet smack of his jaws working through venison pie, the clatter of silverware against pewter, and the heavy silence of servants who pray he doesn't choke on the spot. Eating is no longer pleasure, it is compulsion, and with every bite he feeds the very diseases gnawing at him. The Tudor court revolved around food like a planet around its sun. Banquets were statements of power, and Henry was the brightest, hungriest star. Records show he could consume thousands of calories in a single sitting. Spiced beef, swan, goose, lamprey pie, sweetmeats, marchpane. Wine flowed as freely as water, with ale for balance, because in his world, water itself was suspicious. All this might sound like royal indulgence, but for a man suffering obesity, ulcers, and likely diabetes, it was nothing less than poison disguised as privilege. Here's a mainstream fact. Gout, that so-called disease of kings, plagued Tudor nobles precisely because of this kind of diet. Meats, wines, and sweets that only the wealthy could afford. Henry fits the profile perfectly. Contemporary reports describe him clutching at his joints, grimacing, unable to walk without pain. Yet he never curtailed his appetite. Even when his doctors pleaded for moderation, he snapped at them with the force of a monarch used to obedience. And then there's the quirkier detail. Some sources suggest Henry demanded spiced hippocras wine and sugared almonds at night, claiming they aided digestion. Imagine downing rich wine and candy-coated nuts as a midnight snack while your leg is rotting and your weight crushes your lungs. It's the kind of royal logic that feels more like denial than medical strategy. You wouldn't last 2 nights on that diet, but Henry clung to it as if refusing simple food meant refusing weakness. Historians still argue whether his diet was sheer indulgence or calculated defiance. Did he eat like this because he couldn't stop, or because kingship itself demanded the performance of excess? To be seen nibbling like a monk would have undercut his authority. To feast, even when dying, was to insist that he remained Henry VIII, larger than life, larger than death. Yet the food did more than feed him. It fed infection. Modern medicine tells us that diets high in sugar and fat weaken immunity, worsen circulation, and accelerate the decay of wounds. In Henry's case, every pastry and goblet of wine hastened the rot, turning his body into a banquet for bacteria. The irony is cruel. The king who could command armies and shape churches could not command his own appetite. You watch a servant bring in a platter piled high with roasted quail, its skin glistening in the firelight. The king waves him closer, then closer still, until the trembling youth is nearly brushing against the canopy bed. One wrong word, one tremor in his hand, and Henry might send him to the tower. The boy bows low, retreats, and the silence swells again, punctured only by the rasp of chewing. But as Henry swallows, his face sags. His eyes, once blazing with appetite, dull for a moment. It is not satisfaction you see there, but exhaustion. The feast, like everything else, has become a performance too heavy to bear. He eats not to live, but to deny death, and in doing so he edges closer to it. The chamber grows heavier, thick with the scent of grease and sickness. And you, watching, know that the king's greatest banquet is also his slowest poison. The whispers travel faster than the smoke curling above the fire. In the corridors outside Henry's bedchamber, servants trade rumours like coins, and the boldest one of all is this: the king is dying of syphilis. You catch fragments of gossip. The sores on his legs must be chancres. The madness in his rage is surely proof of the French disease. The decline of his once glorious body too sordid to be explained by mere obesity. It's a tale that has survived centuries, whispered into textbooks, films and novels. But is it true? Or is it just another attempt to turn a rotting monarch into a scandal fit for tavern laughter? The truth is slippery. Syphilis was rampant in 16th century Europe, a relatively new plague that terrified physicians and moralists alike. It spread like wildfire through armies, brothels and royal courts, leaving behind its unmistakable scars, pustules, disfigured noses, and madness in its final stages. Henry certainly lived a life ripe for infection. 6 wives, countless mistresses, and a court humming with intrigue. It makes for a tantalizing match, but the evidence, not so convincing. Historians still argue whether his symptoms align. Yes, his ulcers were ghastly, but syphilitic sores don't linger for decades the way his leg wounds did. Yes, he grew paranoid and explosive, but his temper had been legendary long before his supposed infection. And yes, he left behind a tangled line of heirs, but infertility wasn't really his issue. He fathered children by multiple women, though only a few survived the brutal gauntlet of Tudor childhood. In short, the syphilis theory seems more gossip than diagnosis, a convenient way for courtiers and later writers to explain away his grotesque decline. But here's the quirky detail. Some of his physicians may have treated him as if he had it. Mercury ointments, a common cure for syphilis in the 16th century, were rumoured to have been used on Henry. Imagine slathering toxic metal paste on already festering wounds. Hardly the road to recovery. The treatment itself could cause tremors, tooth loss, and madness. So even if he didn't have syphilis, the so-called cure might have made him worse. This is where the picture blurs further. One chronicle hints that Henry occasionally suffered from headaches, memory lapses and mood swings, symptoms that could match late-stage syphilis, or just as easily match traumatic brain injury from his infamous jousting accident in 1536. That single crash, when his horse fell on him, left him unconscious for hours and may have damaged his frontal lobe, changing his personality forever. You can almost see it. A king knocked senseless in the mud, only to rise again, not as the charming prince of old, but as the tyrant who would order executions at the flick of a wrist. Still, the rumours persist. Even centuries later, Victorian writers clung to the syphilis theory, because it carried a sting of poetic justice. The lustful king undone by lust itself. How neat, how moral, how storybook. But reality rarely ties its bow so perfectly. The ulcers, the obesity, the diabetes, the possible kidney disease, these explain more than the French disease ever could. And yet, in the candlelit corners of Henry's final nights, the servants still whisper, for gossip is easier to carry than truth. You look again at the king, his chest heaving, his lips working silently as though arguing with ghosts. Did he know of the rumours? Did he sense that even in death his body would become a battlefield for speculation? Perhaps, or perhaps the fever drowned such concerns. Either way, the gossip clings to him like the stench of his wounds, and it will not fade for centuries. In this chamber, though, the effect is immediate. Courtiers step back, avoiding the spray of his cough, the touch of his hand. They fear him, yes, but they also fear contagion. And so the mighty king lies in isolation, surrounded by whispers, dying not just from his body's betrayals, but from the stories spinning around it. The bed groans beneath his bulk, and you feel the floorboards sigh in sympathy. Henry is no longer the lean athlete painted by Holbein in his prime. He is an immovable mountain of flesh, swollen with decades of indulgence and disease. Obesity has become his crown, the one burden he cannot cast off. Every breath is laboured, his chest rising with the slow grind of bellows filled with damp ash. You can almost hear the strain of his heart pounding furiously to move blood through a body that has simply grown too heavy to serve him. In Tudor times, obesity was rare among common folk, who laboured in fields and lived on bread, pottage and ale. To be plump was a sign of wealth, a badge of privilege. But Henry's size was beyond privilege, it was pathology. Contemporary accounts place his waistline at nearly 54 inches, and by the end he required special hoists and pulleys to move between bed and chair. Even his palaces had to be adapted, with ramps constructed so that the king could be wheeled about instead of climbing stairs. For the once vigorous hunter who thundered across fields on horseback, the humiliation must have burned nearly as fiercely as his ulcers. Mainstream historians point to the 1536 jousting accident as the turning point. Before it, Henry was muscular, broad-shouldered and restless, famed for outpacing younger men. After it, he spiralled into inactivity, immobilised for months, and never regained his athletic edge. As his weight ballooned, so too did the list of ailments. High blood pressure, likely type 2 diabetes, and a heart straining under its impossible load. In an age without scales, no one knew the precise number, but by modern reckoning he would have tipped over 380 or 400 pounds. Here's the quirk. His armour tells part of the story. At the Tower of London, curators display his suits like silent witnesses. Early pieces are narrow and tailored, befitting the dashing prince. Later ones are shockingly wide, the breastplates bulging forward, the waistbands flaring outward to encase his enormous frame. One particularly late armour has a belly so pronounced that guides sometimes joke it looks more like a beer barrel than a war machine. The steel doesn't lie. Henry grew massive, and quickly. Historians still argue whether this size made him more dangerous. On one hand, his immobility worsened his paranoia, as he could no longer ride among his soldiers or personally enforce his authority. On the other, his temper flared with increasing volatility, as though his body's confinement translated into cruelty of command. Orders for executions, wives, friends, nobles, piled up in the years of his greatest girth. Was this political necessity, or the fury of a man trapped inside a prison of flesh? The servants knew the truth, even if they dared not speak it. Hoisting him into bed was back-breaking labour. Changing his bandages required multiple attendants to lift folds of skin, exposing ulcers that wept constantly. Imagine the terror of being the one to accidentally pinch the king's sore flesh, provoking a scream of pain that could easily spiral into accusations of treachery. A single wrong move, and your career, or your head, might be over. And yet, despite the weight, despite the agony, Henry still demanded the rituals of majesty. He wore silks stretched to their limits, belts studded with jewels, and robes designed to conceal rather than reveal. At banquets he forced himself into the posture of command, though his breathing rasped between courses. He performed kingship as if sheer willpower could disguise the truth, that his body was killing him faster than any enemy could. You study him now, propped among cushions, his face red with effort, his legs swollen like tree trunks. There's something tragic in the sight, but also something unnerving. He's not a man who accepts weakness, not even in his final days. His body may have betrayed him, but his gaze, sharp, calculating, furious, still demands fear. And so the courtiers bow lower, the servants step lighter, and the great obese king lingers on, crushed beneath the crown of his own flesh. The fire burns low, and the king mutters words that blur between prayer and curse. His swollen body tells one story, but inside him may have been another, a storm of hormones gone haywire. Modern medicine, peering back across the centuries, whispers a theory Henry's physicians could never have named: Cushing syndrome. You can almost feel the chill of hindsight as you watch him toss restlessly, his face round, his skin blotched, his mood snapping like brittle twigs. Cushing's, caused by excessive cortisol, produces exactly the symptoms Henry displayed in his later years. Obesity centred on the trunk, a swollen moon face, fragile skin prone to sores, and sudden, violent mood swings. Add to that his infertility with several wives, and the puzzle pieces begin to align. Yet in Tudor England, the word hormone didn't even exist. His doctors saw only the outward signs and prescribed poultices, bleeding, and prayers, none of which could calm the storm raging invisibly inside him. The mainstream fact is clear. Henry's medical records, fragmentary though they are, point to more than just overeating. His weight gain after 1536 was rapid and relentless, suggesting a deeper metabolic shift. Even his leg ulcers may have been worsened by impaired healing common in endocrine disorders. It is sobering to imagine that a single gland, perhaps a tumour on the pituitary, might have toppled one of the most powerful men in European history. And here's the quirkier tidbit. Among the relics of his reign are descriptions of him sweating profusely, even in cool weather, so much so that he carried handkerchiefs to mop his brow constantly. Some chalked it up to gluttony, others to fever, but excessive sweating is another symptom of hormonal imbalance, one that would have humiliated him in public. Picture a king trying to thunder through a proclamation while mopping his face like a nervous merchant. It hardly fit the image of divine monarchy he so carefully cultivated. Historians still argue whether this diagnosis holds water. Was it truly Cushing's, or a stew of injuries, infections, and indulgence? Skeptics note that Henry lived for years after a supposed endocrine collapse, whereas untreated Cushing's often shortens life dramatically. Others counter that his wealth and constant medical attention stretched his survival beyond what a commoner could expect. The debate continues, straddling the line between science and speculation, leaving Henry's body as much a riddle now as it was to his physicians then. What is not debatable is the effect on his mind. You watch him snarl suddenly at a servant who shifts too loudly. His eyes blaze, then dull, then blaze again, like a torch sputtering in the wind. Once known for his charm and wit, he has become unpredictable, terrifying in his volatility. Courtiers never know whether they will be rewarded with a smile or condemned with a signature. The entire kingdom trembles at the fluctuations of one man's failing body chemistry. Imagine the suffocating tension in that room. A monarch prone to hallucinations, explosive anger, and crushing fatigue, surrounded by men and women who must flatter him to survive. Even now, as his health collapses, the machinery of state bends itself to maintain the fiction of Henry the Great, Henry the Unstoppable. But behind the closed doors of this chamber, the truth is unmasked. His body is chaos, his mind its captive, and no prayer or potion can restore the balance. The fire spits a spark, briefly illuminating his bulk. For a moment he looks less like a king, and more like a man consumed from within, a victim of biology no crown could defend against. The courtiers see it too, though they bow lower, pretending not to notice. Only history will whisper the possibility that one of the most feared monarchs in history may have been undone not by enemies, not by sin, but by a tiny, unseen tumour in the shadows of his brain. The candle gutters, and for a heartbeat you see him not as he is now, but as he was then. Close your eyes, and you can almost hear the clatter of hooves on tournament grounds, the laughter in the great hall, the music that once followed him like sunlight. Henry in his youth was dazzling. Tall, broad-shouldered, golden-haired, a man who composed songs, wrote poetry, and thundered through forests with a bow in hand. Ambassadors marvelled at him, calling him the handsomest prince in Christendom. It feels impossible to reconcile that image with the swollen body slumped before you now. And yet, here lies the same man, his life a living contrast between radiant beginnings and monstrous ends. The mainstream fact is stark. Henry was never meant to be king. His elder brother Arthur was groomed for the crown, while Henry enjoyed the freedoms of a younger son, learning languages, dabbling in music, thriving as a scholar and athlete. When Arthur's death thrust him into the role, he embraced it with youthful energy, embodying Renaissance ideals of strength, grace, and charisma. Holbein's portraits capture that era. The broad stance, the commanding gaze, the confidence of a man who believed his body itself was proof of divine right. But now look again. That body has betrayed him utterly. Where once his legs carried him to victory in jousts, now they are bandaged, ulcerated, useless. Where once his figure cut a fine silhouette in gilded armour, now he sprawls so heavy that servants strain to lift him. His face, once lean and bright, is bloated and blotched. It is as though the youthful prince has been devoured from within, leaving only the grotesque shell of a king. Here's the quirky detail. Even in his final decline, Henry clung to the trappings of his younger self. He had his tailors stitch outfits that mimicked the cuts of his early reign, widening seams and lengthening hems to disguise his bulk. At court masques, he demanded costumes embroidered with jewels so heavy that attendants had to help him stand under their weight. Picture a man insisting on playing the role of Apollo while looking more like Bacchus. Still terrifying, but also pitiable. Historians still argue whether this transformation was inevitable. Was Henry's decline simply the toll of age and injury, or was it uniquely tragic given his dazzling start? Some suggest his fall from golden prince to grotesque tyrant became part of his legend, a cautionary tale of power's corrupting weight. Others argue the young Henry was already ruthless, and the rot of his later years was just the visible mask of what had always been there. You stand between these interpretations, gazing at a man who embodies both beauty and decay. The contrast haunts his courtiers too. Many of the older ones remember the dances, the hunts, the feasts where Henry outshone everyone. To watch him now, drooling as he dozes, must have felt like watching a sun collapse into ash. But they dare not voice their grief or revulsion. Instead, they bow, flatter, and pretend. Pretend that this bloated figure is still the vibrant prince they once adored. Pretend that the decay doesn't matter, so long as the crown rests heavy on his brow. And you, standing at the edge of the chamber, feel the weight of that contrast pressing down. It is not just a man dying, it is an era unravelling. The boy who sang madrigals has become the tyrant who orders executions with a flick of the wrist. The golden youth is buried beneath layers of flesh, pain, and paranoia. The tragedy is not only his, it is England's too, for the kingdom has followed him through this metamorphosis. Gilded at first, corroded at last. The king stirs, muttering. For a fleeting second, the candlelight catches his eye, and you see the faintest trace of the boy prince in that gaze. Then it flickers out, swallowed again by shadow and sickness. The memory is gone, and only the monster remains. The chamber is crowded now, though no one dares make noise. Priests shuffle near the walls, their vestments rustling softly like wings of uneasy birds. Courtiers hover in clusters, their whispers clipped short whenever the king's breathing hitches. Servants cling to the shadows, waiting to dart forward at a gesture. Everyone is here, drawn into the orbit of Henry's deathbed, yet none are sure how to act. You can almost feel their dread. What if he recovers and remembers who stood too close or too far? What if he dies, and the wrong man is seen taking charge? The air hums with fear, as palpable as the stench of sickness. The mainstream fact is that deathbed rituals in Tudor England were carefully orchestrated affairs. A priest was meant to be summoned early enough for confession, absolution, and the holy oil of last rites. The monarch's soul had to be prepared, not rushed. But with Henry, hesitation reigned. No one wanted to be the first to suggest the king was dying. To speak it aloud could be treason, as though wishing death upon the king. And so, the summons for the priest was delayed, dangerously so, until his condition was undeniable. It was less a pious decision than a political calculation. Fear of Henry's wrath, even at the very edge of death. Yet here's the quirkier detail. Some accounts claim Henry, in his delirium, refused confession altogether. He muttered about his sins, yes, but resisted formal absolution, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of fear. Others say he clutched at his sheets, demanding to see Jane Seymour, the wife he had loved, or at least idealised, above the others. Imagine the awkwardness of priests trying to coax a dying king into repentance, while he called out for a woman who had been gone for more than a decade. Historians still argue over the exact scene. Did Henry die defiantly, unrepentant, thundering against God as he had thundered against the Pope? Or did he crumble at the end, whispering prayers and begging for mercy? The chronicles diverge, coloured by politics. Protestant writers softened the edges, portraying a king who died secure in his new faith. Catholic commentators, however, described a death full of torment, as if divine justice had claimed its due. The truth likely lies in the feverish mutterings of a man too far gone to stage manage his exit. You picture the tension in the room as his chest rattles. No one dares move first. The courtiers eye each other, each calculating how history will judge their role in these final hours. Edward Seymour, uncle of the young Prince Edward, lurks near the bed, already dreaming of power once Henry breathes his last. Others think only of survival, which faction to join, which words to echo when the new order begins. It is less a holy vigil than a chessboard, the pieces shifting silently while the king lies gasping in the centre. The servants see something else. They see the sores, the bloodied sheets, the stink of a body collapsing in on itself. They see the great Henry VIII, terror of Europe, reduced to a wheezing bulk tethered to life by sheer stubbornness. For them this is not politics but a grotesque spectacle, a reminder that even kings rot. Some of them cross themselves, others just try not to faint. The priest finally approaches, cautiously as though stepping into a lion's cage. Holy oil glimmers on his fingers, the ritual words tumbling low and urgent. Whether Henry hears, no one can be certain. His lips move, but whether in assent or resistance, it is impossible to tell. The room holds its breath, and you with it. For a moment, time itself feels suspended, every eye fixed on a king who once commanded nations, now powerless before his own failing body. The silence stretches. Then the rasp of his breath breaks it, and the vigil continues, the court balanced on the knife edge between loyalty and fear, waiting for the inevitable fall. The candles burn low, and the chamber settles into that eerie stillness that always follows a final breath. Henry VIII is gone. For a moment, there is no triumph, no tears, only the heavy realization that the man who bent England to his will lies lifeless on sweat-soaked sheets. But if you thought death brought dignity, think again. What followed was not solemn majesty. It was a grotesque comedy of errors that turned into one of the most infamous legends of Tudor England. The mainstream fact is that his body was embalmed, sealed in a lead-lined coffin, and transported toward Windsor Castle for burial beside Jane Seymour. It should have been simple. A stately procession, hymns sung, banners lowered. But the journey took days, and winter air was not enough to preserve a corpse already swollen with infection and decay. Servants whispered that the coffin swelled as though breathing, the pressure inside building like a grotesque drum. At one stop along the route, disaster struck. The coffin leaked. Dark, foul-smelling fluid seeped through cracks in the lead, staining the floor of the chapel where it rested overnight. Here's the quirk. Later writers embellished the tale until it became legend. Chroniclers claimed that dogs broke into the chapel and licked at the puddle beneath the coffin, a macabre parody of the biblical story of King Ahab, whose blood was lapped up by dogs as punishment for his sins. For centuries, preachers used the story as proof that Henry, who defied the Pope and dissolved monasteries, met a death of divine judgment. Was it truth or propaganda? Historians still argue whether the dogs were real, or whether the tale was spun by his Catholic enemies, eager to stain his legacy with the image of a king whose corpse literally burst apart. What cannot be denied is that his body did deteriorate grotesquely. In an age without refrigeration or modern embalming, a man of Henry's size, riddled with infection, would have decomposed rapidly. Imagine the tension of courtiers trying to maintain the illusion of royal grandeur while the smell of rot seeped from the coffin, clinging to their robes, staining their memory of the king's final days. You wouldn't last a minute in that chapel without gagging. And yet the spectacle continued. Trumpets blared, processions marched, banners flew. The kingdom was meant to see majesty, not decay. Behind closed doors, however, attendants gagged as they carried the king's bloated remains, praying silently that the coffin would hold until burial. It was a theatre of power in which the main actor was already gone, leaving only the grotesque props of death to carry his story. Some whispered that this physical explosion was fitting. Just as Henry's appetites had burst the bounds of moderation in life, so too did his corpse burst the bounds of its coffin. The body itself became a metaphor for his reign. Excessive, uncontainable, destructive even in death. Others clung to denial, insisting the leakage was exaggerated, the dog story slander. But the damage was done. In taverns and pulpits alike, the tale of the king who exploded in his coffin spread like wildfire. You stand at the edge of that scene, the chapel dim, the air heavy with incense trying and failing to mask the odour. Somewhere outside, trumpets sound for a king already corrupted, already reduced to a cautionary tale. The coffin rests heavy before the altar, sweating, straining, as though the body inside still fights against containment. For a man who spent his life refusing limits, of church, of law, of flesh, it is almost poetic. Death could not silence Henry neatly. Even in his coffin he made a spectacle. And so the courtiers bow, the priests chant, the procession moves on. But the image lingers, not the majesty of a Renaissance monarch, but the horror of a body bursting apart, leaving behind a legacy as rotted as the flesh within. The procession winds at last to Windsor, and the swollen coffin is lowered into the earth beside Jane Seymour, the wife who gave him the son he craved. The great doors close, prayers are murmured, and officially the reign of Henry VIII is over. But for you, standing in imagination at the edge of history, the story doesn't end here. His body may be buried, but his shadow lingers, stitched into the lives of the women he ruled over, and etched into the bloodline that will carry both his glory and his rot. The mainstream fact is that his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, would both wear the crown he left behind. Mary Tudor, the child of his first wife Catherine of Aragon, inherited not only the throne but also her father's burdens, fragile health, paranoia, and the weight of justifying her claim. Elizabeth, daughter of the beheaded Anne Boleyn, would go on to reign gloriously, but not without carrying the scars of her father's choices. A broken church, a fractured nobility, and a family tree pruned with an axe. These were her inheritance. The curse of Henry's decay was not only physical but political, seeping into the reigns that followed. Here's the quirky detail. Even after his burial, Henry's ghost seemed to haunt Windsor. Local tales claimed strange noises echoed near his crypt, as though the restless king still stalked the corridors. One rumour insisted that during Elizabeth's reign, courtiers swore they heard the booming step of a man too large for silence. Was it superstition, or the lingering guilt of a dynasty built on executions and betrayals? No one could say for certain, but the whispers kept his presence alive long after the coffin sealed shut. Historians still argue whether Henry's legacy was triumph or tragedy. On one hand, he established the Church of England, strengthened royal power, and left behind a son and two daughters who carried the Tudor name into history. On the other, he bankrupted the treasury, decimated monasteries, and sowed distrust that scarred England for generations. His personal decay mirrored the instability of his realm, a king who seemed immortal in youth, only to crumble before his people's eyes. You linger in that crypt, where the stone is cold and the silence oppressive. Imagine standing before the slab that covers him, knowing what lies beneath. Not the grandeur of a monarch, but the remains of a man undone by his own body, his appetites, his pride. Yet above that stone the world still spins the myth. Portraits of a majestic king in velvet and fur, jaw set, eyes commanding. The truth of the rot beneath is hidden, buried, whispered only in shadows, and maybe that's fitting. Henry's life was always theatre. Pageants, banquets, ceremonies. Even in death his legacy performs. Half legend, half nightmare. You walk away from the crypt with the uneasy sense that you've seen not just the fall of a man, but the echo of something larger, the way power itself can corrode, swell, and finally burst apart, leaving a stink that lingers long after the trumpets fade. So now, as the last echoes of this tale settle, let your mind loosen from the heavy stones of Windsor and drift into quieter places. The clamour of court fades, the flicker of candlelight dims, and the grotesque image of Henry's body softens into mist. You no longer hear the groans of a dying king or the rustle of fearful courtiers, you hear only the gentler hum of your own breath. The story of Henry VIII is not one of comfort, but in its telling it reminds you that even the loudest, most terrifying figures are only human. They rise, they shine, they falter, and they fade. What remains is not the stench of rot nor the weight of a coffin, but the stillness that always follows, the quiet that enfolds every rain, every life, every storm. Let yourself sink into that stillness now. Imagine the air cooling, the fire dying low, the long corridors empty and safe. The world outside can wait. For tonight, you can rest, knowing that history's darkest truths are only stories now, shadows that dissolve when you close your eyes. Sleep warm, sleep safe.